Good morning, Linked HR. I'm Dr. Cris Wildermuth, your community chair, and today, as I promised, I'll continue talking about the meaningful leader. The meaningful leader, as I described in previous sessions, is the leader who generates or who inspires an engaging environment. In other words, meaningful leadership is connected to employee engagement, and that's why we've been talking about this in the last few times that I communicated with you. So last week I talked about our tendency to isolate ourselves into silos or tables or boxes. And today I'm going to bring another consequence of those boxes, and that is a breakup in communications. Last week I shared with you how I run simulations with my graduate students in which I try to make them, or I try to help them collaborate even when they're seated at different tables. That table becomes a box. Well, there is a fascinating consequence of those boxes for my graduate students when I run those simulations, and that is communication grinds to a halt unless there is something that purposely forces those communications between the teams. Even within the same team, you may remember that last week I said that I separated the team into two groups. One group went to one room, one group went to the other room. Even then, the same team, just the fact that they're separated into two teams, they don't communicate as well anymore. When I would pass on information to one team member, it was almost like seeing that communication move in slow motion until it finally reached the entire team, and then until it finally reached the entire class. I had to make several attempts for that to happen. So why is it that our communications break up because we're divided into boxes? Well, it's intuitive, right? We are into boxes, so we communicate within our box. Um, so what are possible other reasons? Well, first, the boxes we're talking about. And our system naturally creates those boxes. How do we create boxes? We have functional boxes. We have geographic boxes. People are in different branches of your organization or they're in different locations. There are even physical boxes within the same building. For example, in what floor you are, or what is the location of your office, or what's the location of your cube. So there are boxes that are naturally created by the system in which we live, the organizational system. What other reasons could there be? Well, last week we talked about social identity bias, in which we tend to prefer people who are in those boxes. In other words, we feel comfortable with the members of our tribe. There could be, though, a couple of other reasons that are related to the box metaphor. The first one is that we don't speak the language of other boxes. And I'm not necessarily talking about national languages, even though national languages is a problem by itself. I've worked with people who were trying to communicate in English because that would be the common denominator. In other words, the common language everybody spoke, but English was the second language for everyone in the team. And there were accents and there were communication problems in the devices they were using. They were trying to communicate via cell phone. There were problems with the cell tower. So sometimes people couldn't understand each other, even if they were theoretically speaking the same language. And it wasn't really some major issue in um, communications theory. It's just that they couldn't understand the language. It's something as basic as that. But we also create languages within our boxes. We create a culture around our function, for example. Uh, Edgar Schein's work on organizational cultures and microcultures is particularly interesting on that light, and I'm going to share with you in one of the links one of the books that you can look by Edgar Schein and see what it is that he said about that. We create jargons. We create ways of saying things that only we can understand. We create shortcuts, and those shortcuts are necessary for communication, or our communications would be too long. The problem now is that we're trying to use those jargons to communicate with members of other boxes, and guess what? We don't understand each other when we do that. The other reason that I would bring up that sometimes we don't think about in terms of why don't we communicate, interboxes, I would say, is that we don't know what we know. There is, if you start to think about it, in fact, I would challenge you to do this exercise. Sit down and write a list of everything you need to know to do your job. Everything. Just take some time to do that. And I had that experience recently because I'm on sabbatical and I had to pass on my work to a wonderful colleague who has taken over for me while I'm on sabbatical and doing my research. The amount of information that I had to pass on to my colleague was insane. And I didn't even realize that I knew all that. I just gained it over time. So part of the reason why we don't communicate is not that we wake up in the morning and say, aha, how am I going to withhold all the information from my colleagues so they absolutely cannot do their jobs and so that they miserably fail. It's not like that. It's that we just don't because we don't realize that that communication is important. So where does the leader come in? What does the leader have to do? Just as the leader needs to be purposeful about breaking our default for competition, the leader also has to be purposeful about inspiring and promoting an environment of openness, transparency, and shared information. There need to be structures in place. There need to be rewards in place. There need to be specific moments in which information is shared. The problem of the boxes and the different jargons and the things that we don't know that we know, those things need to be shared with people. One last thing I wanted to say, and then you can read my blog and there's more detail in there. And that is when I looked at my data on a survey that I conducted, I believe I had more than 650, 680 people, if I remember this correctly. And I ran some statistical analysis on the relationship between employees' perceptions of the leader's efforts to improve communications and the employees' engagement. And I found a significant relationship there. It was, if I'm not mistaken, a 0.4 correlation, 0.45 or something along those lines, which doesn't mean that communications explains the whole thing. For one thing, correlation doesn't mean cause. And for another, a 0.45 maybe would explain about 20%, 25% of the variability. I'm calculating this by head very quickly. But there's a lot that impacts engagement. So to think about something that could be explaining about 25% of the variability, it's something that, you should be paying attention to. And the specific questions that I asked employees in my survey on engagement and communications were, and now I'm going to have to cheat and look because I won't remember them by heart, and they were: my leader openly shares information whenever possible. My leader encourages followers to share information, and that happens purposely as well. My leader is a good listener, pays attention. There was another question. My leader pays attention to whatever it is that I say, and my leader promotes a culture of transparency. And the average of those items was connected to every component of engagement that I was looking at: the employee's passion for what he or she does, the employee's energy at work, the employee's pride in the organization. All those subcomponents of engagement were connected to communications. So this is something to think about. So here are my questions for today for you to reflect, and I'm truly interested in your answers because I'd like to continue writing about this and continue working on the meaningful leader. My plan is to eventually write a book on that. So the questions are, what examples have you seen in your organization of, and I'm going to go contrarian here and ask you for examples of terrible communications, because those are usually easier for us to think of and frankly more fun. So, what have you seen in your organizational life? It doesn't have to be in your current organization that you're like, oh my, this was bad in terms of communications. And then the second question is, all right, what advice do you have? What have you seen in any organization in which you worked that actually improved communications, not only within the team, but between teams? And if you are a communications consultant, I'm really interested in hearing from you. Please share with us your best practices, your ideas. What is it that you tell your clients about communications? Once again, I invite everyone to share your best resources in our Knowledge Center in linkedhr.com. I'm going to put in the link. And in the announcement this week, I'm going to share a couple of good resources that people have already placed in there. And finally, something exciting and a shameless plug at the same time. The something exciting is that we are planning, the management team is planning a summit, a virtual summit on diversity and inclusion best practices. And the shameless plug is that I am looking for internal people, people who work inside organizations and who can tell me what worked in their organizations so that we can have some interesting interviews and some interesting data to share in our summit. I'm particularly interested in interviewing vice presidents of HR or chief HR officers or diversity czars, diversity directors, whatever the name of the position would be in your organization, who have implemented diversity and inclusion initiatives that were very successful. Very interested in hearing from you. If you would consent to being interviewed, it shouldn't take more than 20, 30 minutes, and we can do that by Zoom, virtually. Please send me a private message and then we'll arrange having a conversation this semester sometime. Okay? So thank you so much, everyone. Always a pleasure to talk to you all and happy learning.